Hello, this is Silas. I'm back again with Steven. Say what's up.
Hello, everyone.
We're continuing the series of this conversation series where we talk about different things and I just drop something. Go ahead and get that. Um, we're reading the book, or Steven read the book, Why We Believe in Gods, in parentheses, the S, and the God, parentheses S, A Concise Guide to the Science of Faith. And this is by J. Anderson Thompson. I think it was I'm forgetting the name of the other individual. It was
Clare Aukofer, or
yeah, Clare Aukofer. Claire. It was Aukofer. We were wondering how they actually spell it. Maybe you should go and
Aukofer.
check.
Yeah,
It
the
was
German in me
Claire.
wants to.
Yeah,
The
go ahead.
German in me
Sorry.
wants to say Aukofer, but I don't know.
Yeah, it was like
No.
Aukofer. Because I was thinking it's probably Nigerian or it's probably something like a West African name. And the Clare is Clare if you want to check for that. And Richard Dawkins, who's a more famous biologist. Like he's also a famous atheist and things like that. So they came together and wrote this book, and Stephen has read it, and then he's going through this conversation, the conversation series, and some of the ones that we have. He reads different actual excerpts from it, and then we discuss them. Stephen, tell us a bit about this book.
Sure. So this book, as you can see, Why We Believe in God (parentheses S), it explores the origins behind religious beliefs from both an anthropological evolutionary psychology and also a neuroscience standpoint. So the idea of, because we evolved in tribes, we evolved to cooperate. This led to religion emerging as an adaptation of some of those things. Now, the author does a very good job, of course, we're going to get into, as far as why did each specific thing involve that ultimately contributes to religion. Each thing is a different piece of the puzzle. So why do people do rituals? Why do people feel the need to stay with their group? Why do people need to explain away things that they don't understand, et cetera, et cetera? And when you understand each piece of this puzzle, it makes sense why people have religious beliefs. And I found this topic very fascinating. I got into this via James Lindsay. He recommended this book. The book itself isn't huge. I think it's like 100 pages, but it has a lot of good information in a very short time, and I think it's very well written.
Yeah. And in the first part of the conversation, we've gone over the first chapter, which was In the Beginning was the Word, Our Propensity to Believe. Second chapter, which is In the Image and Likeness. We've had that conversation before. I don't know if I'm going to post that entire thing as one, because it was about 2.5 hour conversation. Then
Sure.
Our Daily Bread, Craving the Caretaker. That was chapter 3. Chapter 4 was All That is Seen and Unseen, Conceiving Souls. Chapter 5 was Because the Bible Tells Me So, Believing in the Invisible. And today we'll be on chapter 6, which is And Deliver Us from Evil, Anthropomorphizing God. Then parentheses S, gods. So with my background, I was raised a non-denominational Christian. I remember I went to a couple of Catholic schools. I was born in France. I moved to Kenya, then moved to the United States of America. And throughout all that time, my parents had still remained into their Christianity and was going to different churches and learning how different cultures and different places had their relationship with God, and myself trying to work my way through that. And then when I got towards high school and towards the end, I was really kind of like, not really completely on this. I was at that point where I was kind of in that area of, oh, we're talking about the same gods in different religions. I remember taking a comparative religion course in high school that went into the different things. It was like, oh, Buddhism is kind of a thing where it's this kind of the spirituality with these things, and there's a difference between Buddhism. Buddhism is a religion, but it's not a theology because there's no gods. And towards college, I continued having that belief, and then I think towards the end of college, I finally realized like I just don't believe these things, and it's been a process since then, getting more into being more just accepting that I was agnostic for a while, then I was like atheist, and I was strongly anti-theist, and right now I think in my state in life I'm just a-religious, where I see certain things, certain faith-based things. Faith and belief are kind of two different things in my estimation. That's why there's two different words for these things. We believe in a lot of things, but I think faith is a specific subset of belief, not the inverse of that. And I think there's a lot of things in the world right now that are done in a religious sense that is kind of negative, that if we have better means of trying to deal with and understand certain things, all these known unknowns that we have in life, let alone the unknown unknowns. But I think religion was part of the story that we told each other to make sense of the known unknowns. And now we have very many more known unknowns that were not even imaginable. Most of the known unknowns that we have right now, if you listen to this in this culture and society you live in, were unknown unknowns at the time when most of the current religions, theologies, and things generally considered to be theologies and religions were created. So whether it's the secular ones like socialism and communism, which I'll make an argument is actually a religious thing, or the typical ones like Zoroastrianism, to the more current ones like Mormonism and things like that, those things were established in a time when the amount of knowledge that we have right now, that of the things that we can actually have empirical evidence for, is exponentially different. Like, it's not based on those things. Like, if you were rewriting those things based on the knowledge we had right now, there's so many things from back there that you take out. But despite that, the belief in gods, which we're focusing on here, is something that existed before the religions, the theologies that we have right now, and will, I think, continue to exist in a shape and form. Like, I personally am religious, but do I think it's impossible for a being called a god to exist that I would refer to as a god, like something that created the things that I'm aware of? No, I don't think that's impossible. I just don't think any god that has been proposed fits the little amount of knowledge that I myself am able to actually comprehend.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, like the what's his name, Derek Lambert from Myth Vision podcast, he said in a certain sense we're all agnostics, because it's like, I personally, I think this company you're getting, like, I'm not saying I know for absolutely certain there's no God. I know for a fact I'd bet my life. I'm not making that argument. I'm open to the possibility. But as you're saying, based on what a lot of these religious texts said, and we got into it a bit in the last discussion about issues with translations, things added later, things taken out, inconsistencies, contradictions. Can we look at these and say these are blueprints for how to live your life? I don't think so. No. No.
Yeah, because and this is something that also which came up in the last time we were talking about. Some people say, oh, did Jesus exist? Did a human being that the story of Jesus, the character of Jesus in the Bible was based on exist? Maybe. But even if you admit that that person existed, doesn't mean that person was a god. It's just how you have certain things in, I think, the mythos of the United States of America. People might be like, yes, Abraham Lincoln existed, but is he really that person, that honest Abe, above reproach and things like that? It's like, no, like, we can say that someone existed, but the stories told about that person does not necessarily mean those stories are accurate. So that's also something to kind of think of. So a being that created existence could exist right now. It either does exist, it doesn't exist. I think there's only two things. There are only two options. The being either exists or it doesn't exist. So those are the two options there. But I don't think any of the stories told about that being are anywhere accurate to what I would think that being would be, if that makes any sense. And going into something we were talking about how Stephen and I, we value having these conversations. We've had many other conversations based on other things, but just recently we were talking about just religion and faith and the current religions and why people believe it wasn't necessarily in gods, but we specifically were talking about the media, and we're talking about how it's a religious belief, how they accept certain things from them, even though the media seems to be wrong over and over again about things. It says, we're going to do this is true, then it's found out it's not true, then they just say this other thing. But that's the same thing in theologies. Many of the gods that people kept believing in, they kept believing in them until they didn't. All of a sudden something happened and the belief just went away. But before that, there was most of the gods that were created are no longer believed by people. So what is that? So we were looking at that, and I was just thinking about the current things that people religiously worship, like the mainstream media, and just take the things that they say as gospel. And I was just thinking it's underwhelming. Like, I'm not impressed by them. And then we thought, like, wait, okay, I'm also underwhelmed by the other gods, because I was thinking, why are the current year gods more like unimpressive than the older ones? And I was like, wait, the older ones weren't that impressive, because I'm not impressed with Zeus. I think there's cool stories about the other gods and things like that, but I still don't read about them like, oh, that's someone that really impressed me. Like, wow, like having the magic powers and things like that, that's cool, but it's not impressive. I think there's more impressive stories. Like Gandalf, to me, is more impressive than anything I've heard of majority of the gods that are actually created. And then we just had the general question that we're going to ask to anyone listening to this, and thanks for listening, is do you think you have to be impressed by a god? Like, by definition, if something is godly, I think it's impressive. And then I broke it down even further to say that in order for you to actually believe in a God, it has to impress itself. Its existence has to impress itself on just a practical sense without the valuation of it. Just literally has to make an impression on you for you to actually believe that. You can't believe something you have no impression of. Like, I can't believe a certain cookie is the best cookie to have ever eaten if I've never eaten any cookies. So that in that practical sense. But then now, for it to be the best cookie you've ever eaten, would you have to be impressed with it in that positive sense where you're kind of in awe of it? Or is it possible to have a belief in a God that you say this actually is a God, but that God is unimpressive? You're like, this is a boring, worthless being. Like, this is so. That's just a general question to you out there. And I think for me, and part of my process of realizing I didn't believe in some of these was I looked at regular humans in my life and was like, this person seems to be more moral than this being that's supposed to be this godly being that I'm supposed to worship. And that was one of the main things to me that made it hard for me to actually buy into some of these stories.
It's interesting you're saying all this because I was revisiting that book, The Cave in the Light. It's about Plato versus Aristotle and how each one basically their thoughts dominated at different times in Western history and how we've drawn from each of them. And it talks early on in the book, of course, it's explaining the philosophers what their basic ideas were, and they talk about the world of forms and how a lot of people misunderstand the world of forms. The world of forms is an epistemological thing. It's not metaphysical. It's not that there's some physical world of forms where these things exist. It's that we use those as reference points in our minds to envision what things would actually be like. Now, the Aristotelian view is that the world of forms can't exist because things only are based on the facts of reality. So it's like how if you think of some perfect being, it only exists in your imagination. It's not based off some actual perfect being that exists. So I think you and I are more in that Aristotelian vein, and there was an English poet who said everyone's fundamentally an Aristotelian or Platonist. I definitely would say I'm a hard Aristotelian. It's, are things based on the facts of reality? Could this have been sort of inspired by a real person? Maybe, but is there some actual all-powerful being physically existing? Well, unless we see it based on the facts of reality, no.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. That may have not been the most articulate explanation, but that's what. Yeah.
I mean, that's it's part of these communications, and I think that whole thing, it may not be the most articulate explanation, is fitting to what gods are, is fitting to what religions are, is fitting to what theologies were. It's people at that time trying to make an explanation of the things that they can see and observe in reality. So I do understand that, yes, at that point in time, this fit. And some of these theologies were created not because God created the theologies, but because we had that sort of tendency to believe in gods, and then people offered theologies that would cater and serve and organize that system, that general nature that we have. Just like we have a general nature to like certain foods. Then people say, oh, people like to eat, they like to get nutrition, so let's figure out a way to do a cuisine where it's like, okay, we're going to cater to certain people who like these kind of tastes and put them together. Like, yeah, I think that's a good explanation to what I think theologies are. They're essentially cuisines to serve people's need to like eat in that sense. Now it's to serve people's need to nourish themselves in a spiritual sense. Now there's different cuisines where you can have. Someone might like Italian food. Someone might like for their nutrition, for the physical nutrition. Someone might like Middle Eastern theologies, the Abrahamic religions for their for their spiritual nutrition. So I think that's kind of a way to kind of look at where it's at in that.
Yeah, for sure.
And go ahead.
Anything else, or did you just want to jump right in? That's all.
I just want to say that there will be a separate, to be more concise with some of the definitions on the things that we're saying, there will be a separate video released where I'm just going to go to one of the dictionaries and get a list. Right now we have faith, belief, God, religion, theism. I'm going to have those where I just say the basic definitions of those things, and because these words mean different things to different people. And I want to have in the sense that we're using, because I think when Stephen and I talk about these things, we get into the semantics and we can get almost pedantic with some of these things where we're very specific. I'd like to be as specific as possible with the words. Like if I say something and people don't understand, I'm willing to have the conversation stop until they understand exactly what I mean by the word that I used at that point. So I think that's helpful, and it's been helpful in the other conversation series that we had. And just again, with, as I mentioned, there's a difference between belief and faith. The general definition that I find to be most accurate when you're talking about faith in the sense, especially when you talk about religion, when you're talking about gods and things like that, is borrowed from Matt Dillahunty, where he says faith is the excuse people give when they don't have any evidence. Because in this general sense, if you had evidence, you would just provide the evidence to why you think that's true. Whereas if you have a belief, belief is also something that you can't necessarily choose. Like, I can't really tell exactly why I believe that aliens exist. Like, I just have a certain thing. I've gotten enough information. It gets to a point where you're like, before I knew there was space, before I knew there was billions and billions and billions of planets, before I knew it's possible for you to think, okay, if you think you're the only planet, then it's harder for you to believe there could be other life forms out there. But then when I start understanding what life is, I start understanding how long the universe has existed, how big it is. I just have a general belief that, yeah, there's probably a thing that you cross a certain threshold where you've gotten enough evidence where something becomes something you believe, and then something becomes something that you don't believe. Like right now, for example, we're talking about different investments and things like that. Not investment advice, of course, but with there's right now a rally going on with Dogecoin and things like that. And I'm now thinking like, okay, that's something I believe is worth investing in. So I'm getting the process, opening a wallet, things like that. I can't tell you why I knew about Dogecoin an hour before we were talking about this. But then once we started talking about it, I thought, okay, now I believe it's time to actually act on that actual belief. Now, I wouldn't say I have faith in it. Like, it's going to be all of a sudden over $100 and I'm going to be able to retire. Now, if you do that kind of faith thing, maybe I don't have any actual evidence for that. If I just put all my money into it, that's a different thing. But if you have a certain belief, you can invest a little bit into it, because I've seen people like Steven has had a good time with it. Other people have had a good time with it. I see that I have an extra amount of money. I can look at the actual way things have been moving with that. And then you get enough confidence, you have the belief, and you actually do that. But that's just kind of just to show the difference with belief and what I mean by faith. And I think one last thing was, I don't necessarily think there is such a thing as personal beliefs to a general extent, because if you believe something to a certain extent, your actions are going to actually go off of it. And the simple example I gave was in the first video. I was thinking of doing different examples and different ones. Let me think. Can I just think up? But just a simple one right now. It's the one I've mentioned. I believe it's worthwhile to actually invest in Bitcoin or in cryptocurrency. Now, that's one thing. People can just believe that and be like, okay, it's the way you believe, it's the way you act. But are you actually invested in it? When you have the chance to do it, have you actually done it? No. When it gets to the point where now further, that belief takes you to the point where you decide to open your crypto wallet. Is that what I mean, they even they're saying like in that way. But anyway, you open your wallet, you invest in it, that leads to certain actions. Now you take to that point, now you can start saying you're not going to deal with people who have those actions. You can say, if you get in control of something, you can start saying like, I'm going to ban other people who are not using these kind of things. I'm only going to limit myself to these kind of things. So from you having that general belief, if you just have a belief that's at that personal point, then what's the point of actually having the belief if you're not actually acting on it? And it's not a good example right there. You might even edit that out. But what do you think about personal beliefs in that sense? What do you think? How personal do you think?
To sort of add on to your point, you have ideas about investing because it's based on the facts of reality. Like I talked to you about Dogecoin's trend. I talked about other cryptocurrencies that are rallying. That's based on the facts of reality. Faith, like you say, is more the shortcut to, I don't know, so I just sort of insert this here. That's where I would sort of delineate. Whereas you're not just buying random cryptocurrencies and saying, oh, I'll have faith they'll go up. No, you've seen the trends and it's based on a prediction. Now, your prediction could be wrong, but it's still based on the facts of reality. It's not based on things you don't know, or just you're having a belief that something will work out, but it's not based on facts. It's based on someone telling you, or you read it somewhere or something. It's not your own volition, your own reason, all that.
And with the beliefs, when you have that, since it's based on some evidence, now, whether that evidence, it's going to take different levels of evidence for people to believe different things. If somebody is a friend, if somebody is for example, if you have a friend or a spouse or a parent or a child, it will probably take different levels of evidence for you to believe a claim they make than a random stranger. So, like the alien situation I was mentioning, it's going to take a lot more evidence than the footage that I've seen so far. Like just released some new footage of some pyramidal type of things for me to believe that yes, that is an actual alien species that's here on Earth. It's going to take more evidence for me. But for some people,
Yeah.
they already believe that a lot earlier. But I think the difference is when you have a belief, it's based on actual things, and that belief can change. Now, if you just have something that's faith, as I mentioned, it's when you don't really have any evidence because you provide the evidence and it would be more of a belief. And I just have a general questioning for people who do things mostly on faith, who claim, at least claim to be doing on faith, because not quite sure if you really truly can, but they claim to make certain things on faith. And to me, that's suspect to me because I think what is the amount of things that would change you making that claim this is either something to do or something not to do. If it's not based on anything, you might keep doing something because you're not basing you doing that on anything actually tangible, actually existent. And is that too materialistic, or what is the kind of
Well, I would say, we're going to tie into this. This is a recurring conversation. Anyone who talks to me about how a lot of the woke social justice stuff is fundamentally religious. And I've made the argument that a lot of their claims they expect to be taken on faith as well. Like somebody I know posted something recently about I face discrimination and people dare ask me for evidence. It's like, well, if evidence is a bad thing, what are we basing it off of? We're basing it based solely off of what you're saying. If I don't have evidence for what you're saying, I'm taking it on faith. That's an act of faith. And you're railing, these same people will rail against religion as being superstitious, irrational, dogmatic. They're using faith. They don't believe in science, blah, blah, blah. But fundamentally, at an epistemological level, they're doing the same thing. Now, as you and I have said before, there's no magic, there's no divine beings in the sky, but everything else is pretty much the same. It's still dogmatic. It's still taken on faith. It's still not supposed to be questioned, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, they're doing the very thing that they're criticizing. Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. So I think we can get into it now. And
sure. Okay.
We are on the chapter 6.
Yep.
Which was, let me get the title here. Or yeah, it's "And Deliver Us from Evil, Anthropomorphizing Gods." And as mentioned, there will be links wherever you listen to this to the actual book, if you want to get it for yourself, booklet, whatever you want to call it, and read along with us or read for yourself or suggest it to other people. And also feel free to let us know what your thoughts on other things in the book or the excerpts that Stephen reads for us here.
Sure. Okay. All right. So as always, each chapter opens up with a quote from Darwin. The quote here says, "The very essence of instinct is that it's followed independently of reason." So a unique human attribute that favors religion is our tendency to ascribe human-like power or influence to nearly everything we encounter. Why is it that someone will mistake a shadow for a burglar, but not a burglar for a shadow? If you hear a door slam, you will likely think it was a person before the wind. The concepts of a boogeyman or a monster under the bed, think about things like that. Some psychologists think that the monster under the bed thing is a holdover from our distant ancestors who slept in trees at night and had to be wary of predators below. So that instinct, so when children think something is below, that could be what that's from. So our author says here, in quotes, "Humans are strongly biased to interpret unclear evidence as being caused consciously by an agent, almost always a human-like agent. So this may have helped our ancestors survive by being able to detect potential predators and enemies. Better to jump at sudden noises and shadows than to let something approach you unaware. If something did, of course, you might not have survived." Thoughts or comments before I continue?
Yeah, that's just the basic thing where we are on the lookout for certain things. Whereas in the back, if you heard something that you thought was a twig and you just thought it was nothing and you kept walking and it was a predator, it would eat you. But if you just all of a sudden jumped at it and decided to run and then it turns out to be nothing, you would still get a leg up on the people who actually wouldn't do it. But yeah, I think that's very interesting on the actual thing of looking at the monster on the bed. I never really heard that kind of thing, but that kind of makes sense. And that's what I'm saying. These things are these things that we believe, and this is another key thing that I think is good to reiterate, is human beings are animals. Most systems of God belief puts us in a selected group. Like we are selected aside from the other animal kingdom. But no, we are part of the earth. We are earthlings. We're just part of the organism. We are part of nature. Like we're just there's some different things about us being as sentient and things like this. And then we'll go with the anthropomorphization of certain things. So these things did come. So I like going into the roots of why we had some of these beliefs. And another thing here, talking about the not a burglar for a shadow, but then I know they'd say the burglar won't be thought of as a shadow, like in the shadow in the inanimate sense of just something that's reflection of the light on the sense. But then it goes into further with the nature of the shadow. They say there's a demon or there's some kind of evil within the actual burglar that's making the burglar do that. So instead of allowing for the burglar to just be a burglar, being a human animal with its own processes and things, they add that kind of shadow aspect to it. And even shadow itself hasn't been added a valuation aspect of shadows and only negative in the darkness. But again, that comes from our our evolutionary psychology, where the darkness was more dangerous than the light. So that was a kind of thing that's tied in there. And lastly, to finish off, was even you look at the gods, you look at the way we've believed in gods, and that has been anthropomorphized over time. Before it was just animism with the spirits, and we thought there was a force, or we thought that force would come sometimes and interact and get into animals and get into things, speak to us in different ways, or take human form. But it wasn't that. With that whole idea is rather recent to have that whole thing where it's like gods are actually in that bipedal humanoid shape, and we are also similar to them in that sense. That is something relatively recent in the whole history of humans having beliefs in gods. For majority of humanity, gods were not in the human form, and I think the gods of the future might be going to the aliens and type of things like that are probably not going to be in human form per se. Because if we aren't the only life form in the universe, we've already thought of many different ways to be a more successful life form in the universe at large, because most of the universe is very antagonistic to to a biological humanoid mech machine that we are. So there's other forms of existence that we can probably think of and put to mind. Yeah.
I emphasized this last time, but it bears worth repeating, I think, is that with evolutionary psychology, I know this sounds cliche, but it's the whole everything happens for a reason thing. Like, we may think, oh, it's ridiculous that people jump at certain noises, but again, looking at it from the survival standpoint, especially the environments our ancestors were in, it makes sense. And because, like we say, I mean, we were in hunter-gatherer tribes. I think it was what, 2/3 of the world was in hunter-gatherer tribes up until about 500 years ago. That's a blip in the whole span of human history. So it's not surprising we've retained a lot of these instincts and adaptations.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I wonder. Oh, I mean, okay, there's definitely people who do believe in let's say the Abrahamic religions that also believe aliens exist. Like, this is something I ask: where do they think when they go into the whole like we're made in the shape in the form, or we're made in the form? I think they would still, just the same way they would consider themselves to be the selected and chosen people, chosen life form on Earth. They would also expand that to the universe, and they would say like maybe like that's the weird thing. Those are the things that I think would just start exploding some of these things. Like, if you come in and then there's all of a sudden some gaseous being with all these different things, it's kind of traveling between, going between being like being like a gas form and communicating with like radio waves, doesn't really consume things, like just gets like energy from like gamma rays. That's how it feeds itself. Where would that fit in to somebody's kind of belief system on that? I think some of them would find ways to
Yeah.
compartmentalize and rationalize it, but for some of those things, that will be the point of all of a sudden they can't believe those things anymore. So we
Yeah.
don't know where those kind of trips come across. But that's one of the things that's interesting to me when I deep sci-fi, epic sci-fi. Like, operatic sci-fi is my favorite genre of books to listen to, or to read, audiobooks to listen to, or books to read. And sometimes when you have things 3,000 years in the future, like this light speed going through dimensions, going through wormholes and things like that, and people are still believing in Jesus in that time, like, it's hard for me to imagine that belief system continuing once we have that kind of advancement and meeting with those kind of creatures and beings. But that's for me. But I'm already at this unbelief point, so I'm interested in the people who do believe, how they would think that belief would make it through some things that they expect to be probable in the relative near future of the human being's existence. Yeah.
Well, James Lindsay, I think in one of his books, he talks too about how he wonders if a lot of these religious beliefs are going to become like racism or like astrology or something. Like they'll still exist, but they'll be considered very fringe. Like very few people still believe this anymore. I mean, there are still people who believe in the Greek gods. You may be surprised. I mean,
Yeah,
it's like 100,000 people, but it's like
kind of cool.
those groups will exist. Well, Zoroastrianism, I was reading, they estimate there's like 1 to 200,000 of them remaining, and that's one of the oldest religions. Like that's before Judaism. But the thing is, like these things will survive. But again, it's like 0.0000 whatever percent of the world's population will believe in them. I foresee this kind of going in that similar direction.
Yeah. But I mean, that's the thing. Like some of these major religions, we just looked into it, and it's like Mormonism is really not that. It's like a few million people who actually believe that stuff. It's still relatively small in some of these things. So yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Oh.
This next one, it's called Hyper Agency Detection Device. I guess we can call it HAD for short because I don't feel like reading this over and over. This ability is always triggered quickly and deployed easily. This adaptation contributes to religion because it allows and even favors unseen agents, almost always human or human-like. Once the mind makes this connection, it's only a small jump to a ghost, spirit, or eventually, as I'll get into in a bit, an all-powerful being. This adaptation makes it natural for us to assume that an unseen being or beings can influence our life. This also leads us to believing that if this being is asked or pleased in some way, it can help us and alter outcomes, thus how praying was born. Since we evolved to detect faces, we can see human-like figures anywhere. The man on the moon, Jesus on a potato chip, the man on the mountain in Vermont, a smiley face and punctuation marks, or even the quote-unquote the eye of God, which is the Helix Nebula taken from NASA's telescope. That's actually the image on the cover of this book. So this also shows up in the form of ascribing agency to non-agents. So when people say things like the wind is nasty, the sky looks angry, Mother Nature, et cetera, and then of course the Greeks and others did this more dramatically with things like attributing lightning bolts to having been thrown by Zeus, Poseidon caused storms, seductive sirens distracted sailors, so ships wrecked, et cetera, et cetera. So how do decoupled cognition and HAD lead to supernatural beliefs? How do we go from mental conversations with ancestors and jumping at shadows to believing in God or gods? As social beings with these adaptations, we are now set up for the belief in a divine attachment figure. We can attribute agency to it, transfer early life emotions to it, and believe that such a being desires to interact with us. But since this being is invisible and we're still missing a few pieces of the puzzle, how does this turn into a god? All right. Any thoughts or comments before I continue?
So I think, how does a being turn to a god? But you see, in my premise, I was kind of thinking those things are already there. So how? But I guess that's just a different way of asking the question: is how many things does it take for something to all of a sudden fit in to be a sufficient definition, to be sufficiently defined? Like when does something impress itself on you to be a god rather than a really advanced machine, like, or that whole thing, like any sufficiently advanced technologies, like magic, that's kind of situation. And then when does something fall out from being a god? And this goes again back to what I was saying before. Like with the humanity, we have certain ways, we live in certain ways, and then we start. The creations that we have are also limited to those ways. Once you start living in societies and cultures that were, in a sense, that were organized in a way that you were aware that you got this food here, not because you knew every single person that was involved in planting that food, catching that food, preparing that food. Once you realize there was like other human beings in some other place that you're probably never ever going to see, meet, talk to, hear of, like you might not even be able to understand them if you actually saw them, that live and die without you and were a daily part of your life, then our gods kind of started changing and entering those kind of environments as well. So I think in my estimation, gods are made in the shape of humans, of human society, not the inverse. Gods are made in the shape of human knowledge. Like that's why no gods have exceeded the human knowledge that we have. And just like one of the things that, how come gods, like there's something like the concept of time travel, that is something that is very commonly used in just regular storytelling now, like contemporary storytelling, that no god that I know of has had something like time travel involved in it, because people just couldn't conceive time travel. They could conceive long amounts of time, but even that's why you had like 40 days and 40 nights, because even at that time, people just couldn't really conceive thousands and thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of years, let alone being able to jump back and forth in those kind of years and things like that. But yeah.
Yeah, if some of this doesn't make sense either, too, think of it this way. Think of each point I'm talking about as sort of the piece of a puzzle, and that when each piece is inserted into the puzzle, you see the whole image. So these adaptations on their own, like, I mean, I guess the author would say this too, that each adaptation by itself doesn't create religion. It's all these various adaptations working together in tandem. It was like the point I made previously about writing. Like, there's no part of the brain that says this is the writing part of the brain. It's motor skills, visual spatial, all those come together to produce writing. It's the same thing with this. Like, if you're still not clear like this far, I mean, we're obviously not done yet. I understand that you may have more questions, but the thing is, as I lay out each point, you're like, okay, I see how this comes together. That's the feeling I got while reading this book too. All right,
Cool.
So
yeah,
yeah.
that sounds like a really good, well put together book. So definitely pick it up if you're interested at all in the conversation that we've had. Yeah.
So just like I say, if things seem unclear, it's because we haven't gone through every point yet. So, but like once you see all these points working together, it'll make more sense. Okay. Let me see here. Next point. Okay. So the next one is called inferential reasoning in minimally counterintuitive worlds. We fill in the blanks where the information isn't always there. That's what inferential reasoning is. This serves as the basis for minimally counterintuitive worlds. So if you understand spelling and grammatical errors in text messages, for example, you're doing what's described here. Like, you may see spelling and grammar errors, but you can piece together in your mind what the person was trying to say. The example he has in the book is there's a picture. It clearly looks like a clover, but with this white square in the middle, but you can tell it's a clover because you know what a clover looks like. So your mind is sort of filling in the gaps where it's where you don't actually see it. So, but for this to work, it only works if a small element or two is a little off, but not way off. We can kind of piece it together. If the clover was more obscured, you would have no idea what it was. But if it's, okay, that little piece is missing, you can just piece together in your mind what that is. So minimally counterintuitive worlds are the optimal compromise in our minds between the interesting and the expected. These minimally counterintuitive worlds both seize our attention and stand out in our memories. So, for example, the example he gives in the book is that if you were to say to somebody, even a completely mystical person, there's an all-powerful oak tree in your yard. It'll perform all the tasks you want. It'll do your taxes. It'll wash your car. It'll talk to you. You see that's too much of a stretch because it violates too many aspects of what a tree is. Whereas if you think of something, the example, he didn't mention this, but I thought of it, Grandmother Willow from Pocahontas, that's a little more of a less of a jump, because if you think about it, a tree blowing in the wind, there's a carving that could look like a face. They could think that's some sort of spirit. Pocahontas can assign in her mind some sort of voice that it's being attached to when it could really be her own internal reasoning, things like that. It's less of a jump than the oak tree example that I cited. So then you could believe that, all right, this is some spirit embodied, and then during a full moon, if I pray to it, it'll help me in some way. It's less of a jump to do that than the oak tree example. So then think of some of the fairy tales you hear as a kid, like I mentioned in a previous discussion about St. George slaying the dragon, and I remember in CCD kids asking, like, did dragons actually exist? It's like, well, if you believe in all this other stuff, a dragon is not a huge jump. It's a similar thing here. And then same thing with some of the fairy tale stuff, like, okay, the witch from Snow White just drinks a potion and turns into a creature, but it's like, you don't have to a child is not going to think through, wait a minute, could a person's bones and everything reshape themselves? It's like, it's too convoluted. Whereas in a child's mind and a religious person's mind too, it's easier to make that jump. So it's close enough to reality where we can make that jump, but it's not completely beyond the pale. So minimally counterintuitive worlds allow the supernatural to remain connected to the natural world. They also provide explanations and relief for human problems that are rationally intractable, such as death. So think of the ancient Egyptians worshiping cats and seeing snakes as evil and the cause of problems. So, for example, there was the cat goddess Bastet versus Apop, who was the serpent god. Now, cats were good because they killed mice in the granaries, their companions, all that. So they're seen as very benevolent creatures, whereas snakes, of course, biting people, poison, all those things. So snakes are seen as evil. Now, another example here is the Virgin Mary conceived Christ while a virgin, but retained everything else. The Holy Spirit descended and made her conceive Jesus and then faded. That's less of a jump than if you had to break it down, like somehow a spirit came in and did this with her and all that. Like, it's too much of a jump. Whereas if you believe in the Holy Spirit, it's less of a jump for a person to conceive that. So the Christian God is omnipotent, omnipresent, but otherwise he resembles a human. The old white guy in the bathrobe, it's something we can relate to. So think of Jesus being portrayed as both a man and a god. And there was a movie, the one Jesus came out, and I think it was 99 or so. One of the reasons that movie got a lot of praise was because it was a more human view of Jesus, like crying at his father's funeral. He enjoyed partying with his friends, like a more a humanized version of Jesus. And that was it resonated with audience because it's something more people can relate to rather than this like oracle just reciting text up on a mountain. It's here's this being that can sort of relate to us, but at the same time is still a divine being. Um, and then this raises questions though. If God knows our thoughts, why would we need to try and reach him? Wouldn't he know what we need? Are we deceiving ourselves? Okay. Thoughts or comments before I continue?
Yeah, that was, I think it was the Passion of Christ movie with Jim Caviezel by Mel Gibson, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know
Well,
if he's
we're talking about two different movies. The one that I cited came out in '99. That was Jeremy Sisto played Jesus. That Sisto was on 6 Feet Under. I never watched that show, but it got a lot of praise. And
okay.
Gary Oldman actually played Pontius Pilate, which was cool.
Gary
And
Oldman.
yeah, and but again, it was sort of embodying what I'm describing here about Jesus had a more human, relatable side, and that caught on with audiences because it's like it was seen as more interesting because it's like in a way, even though he's considered God and the Son of God, he's someone we can relate to rather than this like divine being completely removed. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, my favorite movie about, I guess it's this is, I guess, some spoiler info. What was it? It was called The Man from Earth. So
Okay.
I guess if you haven't watched the movie, I highly suggest you watch the movie. If you've heard of it or something, take a pause and you can just dip out and watch it and come back and and listen, or jump ahead maybe 5 minutes or so, just a couple of minutes as I discuss what the movie is about. It's essentially you're in this little cabin. It's a well done movie. If you just one location in this cabin, a few professors from this university come to this cabin and they're meeting and they're talking about things. I think one of them is the guy who acted in Candyman. The other guy was
Oh,
this older, kind of chubby man. I'm forgetting the actual name of the guy. Maybe I can look. Um, Man from Earth. Well, they meet there, and there's this one younger guy coming in, and he's just kind of talking to them about. He's talking to them about he's about to move. He's retiring from the school, and he's saying, "Okay, I'm going to head out to somewhere else." And then they're kind of just having a goodbye type of thing, and they just start going by back and forth. And the guy's name was John Oldman, Professor Oldman.
okay.
Um, who's the actor? The actor is David Lee Smith plays John. Tony Todd, yeah, that's Candyman. Jason Billingsley. I forget what Jason. You know the guy's face when you see him. Ellen
Okay.
Crawford. It was a really, really well done film, in my opinion. Will Gruber, who's looks like the Wilfred Brimley guy, like this bigger guy, Alexis Thorpe, and Annika Peterson, and William Catt. So anyway, there's an artist, there's a poet, there's these different people that are coming in, and they have different faces and they're talking about these different things. And anyway, a spoiler: it turns out that the guy actually is immortal, and he's somebody, I think he studied with Buddha, and then he had left that place and he traveled to the Middle East, and he's the person the Jesus story was based on because he
Hmm.
got hemmed up in preaching at that time, passing on what Buddha was saying. Who he'd actually met the individual who was Buddha, because that was an actual person. Nobody really contest whether Buddha existed. And you see this kind of thing, like if Christians say, okay, Jesus existed, so they say because historians have said Jesus existed, that means Christianity must be right. But Buddha is somebody, the person of Buddha is somebody that's a lot more confirmed as an actual being existed. Does that mean he reincarnates? I don't think people would accept that just because we know that Buddha existed, the initial person. But anyway, so he was passing that on, and since he's immortal, he actually got up and left, and that's where the resurrection thing came by. And then people were like, no way, that's a lie, it's not true. Some people were religious there. And it turned out that one of those professors, one of the older professors who was in that place, and I think it was the Dr. Will Gruber, the Richard Riley guy. Turned out that was actually his grandkid. Like
Hmm.
it was his. I think it wasn't his grandkid. I think it was one of his kids from one of his older wives, and one of the women he was with at this time. I think was going to go to travel, and that's just what he's been doing, traveling around Earth. For some reason, he became immortal, and he's just been going around. He meets people, then the spouse, he falls in love with somebody. They grow older. He sees these kids die, and then he leaves. So it's just, it was an interesting, well done kind of story, and to me, and again, I'll just go back to the thing. For me, some of my main objections with the main religions that people speak of, they're just boring. It's just like, it doesn't really make sense. There's a lot better ways to kind of talk about these things, and I really like the continual attempt that humanity has been making to fill in these gaps, to try to make sense of the things that we don't understand. And I think, in part, holding on to some of these older ones is a limitation in the understanding that we can have of the few things that were even possible to even come close to understanding. So, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things, I mean, I don't have a strong stance on the whole historicist versus mythicist view of Jesus. Like, I guess I talked a bit in the last one about R and Ra and his stance. I'm probably most in line with that one because a lot of people cite Bart Ehrman. I actually have him as a friend on Facebook. I added him at one point. He's actually an atheist scholar, but he believes Christ existed as a historical figure, but of course he doesn't believe that he was the son of God and all this. And the thing is, a lot of Christians cite him as an example, but the criticism that R and Ra and others have made is that he's citing Christian historians as his sources. So the problem with this is, would they ever be willing to consider that Jesus did not exist as a historical figure? And I feel like a lot of them would not. But I feel like what it is Christians hold him up and say, look, even an atheist agrees with us. But it's like, if he's using people who are going to say there's no way that Christ could have been a mythical figure, this is all based in history, how reliable is that? And I don't want, I don't know Ehrman. I don't want to accuse him of being a liar or anything. I think he's probably a good scholar, but it's like, it's just the credibility kind of comes into question. It's like when people will hold up St. Thomas Aquinas and be like, well, Ayn Rand praised him. Well, Rand praised him because he helped bring back Aristotle, and that had a positive effect on mankind. It's not the arguments himself that she's praising. It's a similar thing here. Like he's citing historians and he's saying they make good cases, but I also know that they're invested in the historicist position, and they would never even consider the mythicist position. So my question is, how valid could they really be? That's why I'm a little skeptical.
Yeah. And then it goes further where there's certain positive things that you might learn from the story that you can learn even if it's not true. Like this one question that was asked is, if you found out Socrates wasn't real, would that really change the positive things that were attributed to Socrates? And I don't think so. But when it comes to someone like Jesus, there's a key part of him having to actually be the Son of God, because not just some of the things that he says, some of the things that he does. There's too much that I think that's reliant on that aspect for him to be a significant part of history. Now, I'm willing to accept other things, but as we've discussed here and we discuss continually, there's very little that's actually unique about the story of Jesus Christ. Like it's borrowed and taken from other people because humans are humans and humans relate with reality at the same time. And no matter where we were in different places in the universe or on the earth, we've been existing for relatively in the same time, dealing with relatively the same things of the same biological machines coming through the same kind of brain, having the ability to hold the same number of ideas and memories. So those are the things that kind of make sense of why there's so much congruity with the different parts of, I don't know, congruity, is that even a word? of the different parts of the different faiths and different religions that came together. Yeah.
Well, and as I mentioned in a previous movie, in the previous video, this is why you see so many of the same tropes reused in movies, because like it's very hard to come up with original stuff because everybody borrows from someone else. So it's like if you were to spend hours and hours watching all these various movies, you'd see a lot of common ground between them, and then you could find those were based off previous stories and all this. So it's just something people do. It's like there's very little stuff that is built completely from the ground up. Like we did the video about the French Laundry. That's one of the first videos Silas and I did, and I love what Thomas Keller says about how cooking is mostly an evolution. There's very little creativity involved. And he even says, like, a lot of the things I'm doing are not created completely out of the blue. I mean, like, he does peas and carrots, but it's a carrot ravioli with a pea puree. He does surf and turf, but he does different meats and fishes. He does the salmon cornet with the salmon tartare and like what looks like an ice cream cone, but that itself is based off an ice cream cone. So it's like how much of this stuff, like he didn't conceive all these ideas completely out of the blue. It was inspired by other things and then tweak the presentation and flavors and things like that. Oh.
Yeah. And another one of my objections with God beliefs and theologies in that sense is the nature that they're like, this is just ours. This is just ours, and this is also the last. This is the last thing. You can't get better than this. It's not going to get better. You can't improve. You can't adjust. Whenever you get to that kind of level, it's very limiting. And I think the fact that we could adjust, that the fact that other people had their stuff adjusted and taken to create that, let's build on the things that we have. I'm not saying just throw it all aside, but we can build on that and say, okay, these parts are good, these parts not really fit. Maybe we can build on this. Maybe they meant this, but then now that we know this other information about it, let's add to that and see if we can take that further. But there's a lot of people who really hold it to be sacrosanct and that dogma type of thing, and they get murderously violent when you attempt to make any adjustments to some of that content. But yeah.
Yeah. All right. Next section. Self-deception. If we deceive ourselves, we can easily deceive others. He doesn't mention it here, but I thought to myself of the elephant in the brain, like the idea he brings up a politician who says, oh, I'm running because I want to help my community, all of that. But of course, they really want to make money and build their image. AOC, a company like that. But like, it's sort of that, it's that mentality where like a person may genuinely believe they're doing good things, but they sort of ignore their own self-interest or try and lie about it to themselves even. The author says, the human ability for self-deception is crucial to religious belief. If many believers could see their own minds more clearly, they would see that self-deception plays a role in their own acceptance of faith, end quote. So even the utmost faithful take precautions. I mean, and this is a point that I've made, I think, in the previous video and elsewhere as well. I mean, even the most religious people, they look both ways before crossing the street. They buy health insurance. They buy life insurance. They, use reason to decide how they're going to spend and invest their money. Like even the absolute most fanatically religious people use reason on some level. Nobody would do everything based on faith. There's no one, as far as I know, who lives that way. And he makes the point we're ultimately atheists when it comes to other people's gods. Like we expect the same of other people. We expect other people to stop at red lights, be mindful of pedestrians, etc. In the West, we have become so used to people not fully believing what they say that when we hear about things like Islamic extremism, some people are caught off guard by it. Because we will say things like, oh, well, the Bible, this is allegorical, this is metaphorical, it doesn't really mean what it says, there's no reason to actually go through with this, and then they cherry pick the good parts and go by those. So, but they don't realize that in the Middle East, a certain percentage of the population takes what the Quran says very literally and will do what it says. I don't know if you ever saw it, but there was a very good interview with the Sam Harris-Jenk interview. It was a few years ago now, but they broke down a lot of these issues. And that was after Sam's appearance on Bill Maher talking about Islam is the mother lode of bad ideas and all this. And Jenk himself is an atheist as well, but was a Muslim originally. And I feel like what Jenk did was a lot of Islamic apologism, where it was a lot of, oh, well, yeah, the usual, oh, well, it really means this, it doesn't mean this. And it's like, well, you turned away from Islam. If you believed all this to be literal and went by it, you would still be following the religion. And then there was this may not be an exact quote, but there was a good exchange where Jenk was saying this is the issues of fundamentalism, but then Sam's kind of like, well, but that's the point. If the fundamentals can get people to do this stuff, there's something wrong with the fundamentals. Like if you were to leave a group of people on an island with just the Quran, you wouldn't be surprised come back in 100 years or whatever and ISIS is there, because if they're following that literally, well, that's going to be what's produced. If you talk about something like Jainism, the prophet in Jainism, I forget his name, but like he explicitly said, don't harm, kill any living thing, don't do injury, all that. So they'll do things like they won't use certain brooms because they're worried about killing bugs. They'll filter their water so no bugs get accidentally ingested, things like this. But you can point to Jainism directly and you can say, nobody could become a terrorist in the name of Jainism. Nobody could open a slaughterhouse in the name of Jainism, because the scriptures explicitly say don't do those things. But with Islam and Christianity, you can point to things in the scripture where you can draw a logical conclusion. And then that gets to the point of, well, if you're going to pick and choose the parts you like, which parts are you picking and choosing and why? And then we just get into how valid is this stuff. All right. Thoughts and comments.
Yeah. With some of the major ones, it's, I want to say like pathetic necessarily or sad. It's pitiful.
Yeah.
The lengths they go to attach things to say, oh, this meant, when they said this, they meant that. Like there was one that they said, there was something they were talking about, like a gum, like humanity comes from like a gum, and then they say that's something that means like that's that when you actually look at the baby developing as a Blastosaurus, I think is a Pokemon, but like
Blastoise,
pre-zygote kind of level, it's kind of just like a pink glob of stuff, and they're saying, oh, look, now that we saw that's what they meant by looking like chewed gum, that's what Allah meant. I'm like, there's a stretch. like the things some of these people must point out to be like, that's what we meant. Or yes, God created entire existence, but he took some time to come and put his face on some toast to show you that, that he exists. Here's this toast. We're going to put my face on it. And it's like, what is he doing with this? Like, is he just trolling? Like, who? What kind of being do you think creates the universe and then spends time putting, like, tagging toast? Like, it's this the lens that they make to this. And then again, to reiterate what I said, they're called fundamentalists for a reason, because they are fundamentally following the things. So if this content was negative, was not what that being meant, especially when you have the religions that have people who are supposedly in sort of control of these things, why are those things still in those books? Why don't you take those things out? And that's part of my saying of these things are problematic, because some of them you literally cannot remove something. So it's in there. The slaves are in there. Keeping slaves is in there. Assaulting people is in there. Rape is in there. Genocide is in there. So some of these things, I just wonder, why do people still want to believe in gods that supposedly did those things? And that comes down to the thing, do they actually truly believe in it? Because if you do believe into them, I think you are more like the fundamentalists. But like, as you just mentioned, most people who are listening to this, even if you are a believer, chances are you are nowhere close to a fundamentalist. Chances are, if you believe in a certain faith that you attest to be a part of that, if you went back to the initial time that you accept that faith was finally that faith and not the things it borrowed from, you would probably be killed by the people who were believing in it at that time. So that's just something I think most people can't really argue for.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of people pick and choose, and then my problem, of course, with that becomes, well, like, why do you pick certain parts? Why do you say certain things are allegorical? This, like, for example, we had a family friend who he's Catholic, but he's pro-choice, and he's like, I'm a Catholic for choice. It's like, that's a contradiction in terms. The church has been explicitly pro-life. It's like things like that, and it's like, how do you square that in your circle? Square that circle in your head, because they'll say things like, oh, God's laws supersedes man's laws, all this. But then you'll be like, well, I'm a Catholic who supports abortion, but your church says that's wrong and that's supposedly divinely ordained. So how do you like square that circle in your own head? Those are things that I take issue with. And then what really gets me too is the white lefty atheists who will trash Christianity. Again, they'll bring up stuff like you said, but then bend over backwards to defend Islam. Oh, well, that's metaphorical. Well, you don't speak Arabic. You're not a Muslim. You couldn't, understand. That stuff drives me nuts. And what's interesting is if you look up Majid Nawaz, his family's from Pakistan, but he lived in Britain. He's actually debated a bunch of Islamic fundamentalists. And the thing is, he was an extremist in his earlier days, and he speaks Arabic. So he would actually debate them. He said, this says this in Arabic, it means this. They'd be like, well, that's metaphorical. Well, this really means this. And he speaks Arabic, so he knows. And then Gad Saad, same thing. Now, Gad Saad is Jewish, and he was from Lebanon and during the Civil War. So I understand some of his issues with Islam, but he speaks Arabic as well. So he can say the same things. He's like, look, I read Arabic. I know what this says. This says what it's being translated as. Well, and then he always says, like, it's harder for them to discredit him because he's darker skinned and he speaks Arabic. But it's like these people who bend over backwards to defend Islam, it's like, again, from the point of the view of the Muslims, I get it, because like with the Christians, it's the same thing. But these white lefty atheists, it's pathetic. Like, I can't like sympathize with these people. Yeah.
And now that again goes into the whole belief and faith type of things. Because we say things all the time that we don't necessarily believe.
Yeah.
But at the time, okay, we say things that we do not think are true. It's not necessarily lying, but we believe that's the thing to say at the time. Or we're not completely sure. We don't. It's frustrating. It's something for me. It's like something that I also try to do in my own life, is try to get to my point where I'm speaking as accurately as possible and certain things as possible. That's the thing. What's the extent to it? But then, what is considered to be accurate as possible? How much? A simple thing. How are you doing today? I'm fine. How many times do you say that when you're actually not really fine? You don't really actually think about, are you actually fine? So when somebody says something, we just have that general acceptance where you're not really going to believe somebody has said exactly what they say. There's just a certain cordial thing where this is the thing you say in this time to just have some kind of interaction with people. Like, and one of the key things, I'm going to do a separate video about this because it's been bugging me for years now, and I just kept saying what to do it, but I'm like, oh, it's such a short video. But it'll just be less than a minute video of an annoying thing that all like majority of the people that you probably know do this, that speak English do this, is people say, I can't wait. That's one of the things that really bugs me. Oh, this is going to happen. Oh, I can't wait. Like, oh, we're going to start, the next, we've been pushing this back, but we're going to finally do a series of reading Human Action. And I'm like, oh, I can't wait until we start that. Or it's Christmas tomorrow. Oh, I can't wait until tomorrow. When people say that, in most times that they say it, pretty much one of the things they have to do, one of the few things they can do is wait. Because it's like, I cannot wait. It's like, no, you can wait. Like that's all you can do is wait. Because if it's something like, oh, right now I have this pencil, I can't wait until I draw a circle on this paper. I just draw the circle. The circle is drawn. So it's like, in that situation, if you can't wait and it's something that you can do, then you do it.
Yeah.
But if it's something that you literally cannot, you have to wait. In most of the situations, you have to wait. So
it's fitting if, like, let's say you were like bleeding out or something, and you have to go to the hospital. It's like, I can't wait for medical attention, something like that. Like,
but no, because the actual statement is, I can hardly wait, because that's what it's supposed to be. But now that has just been thrown out. Now it's just people say I can't wait, but they mean I can hardly wait. Most people who say it mean I can hardly wait, or it's going to be tough to wait. It's going to be a struggle to wait, and that one I do understand. But there's just a shorthand that everybody has just gotten to the point. They're not intending to lie to you, even though all they can do is wait. They mentally they understand all you can do is wait till tomorrow, but they just say I can't wait. Because I'm using that as an example. Is this something that people say that if you just put a little extra thought into it, you'd realize what you're saying is not really accurate to the actual situation of life. Now I'm wondering, if it's just something that small, how many other things are like that? Is that how most of reality has been? Is there ever a time when we were in situations where we were a lot more accurate into actual reality? I think the people who find themselves to be more insistent on being more specific and accurate to things, that is more for pro-human flourishing. And that's how we've advanced in certain places where we're like, let's not just say things to say things, but let's be more accurate. Let's not just believe this is what we're going to say. But if I think this, before I say this, let me make sure I know what the hell I'm talking about and it's accurate. But I think that's something that belief in God's kind of falls in. People just say they believe to say they believe. They don't literally mean, I believe in the 10 Commandments as they're written. They just say that. It's kind of just like a shorthand. Like instead of I can hardly wait, they say I can't wait. But that really means I can hardly wait. So when they say I believe in X God, I think much fewer people would literally be able to say, I believe in this God, and belief in this God means 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things. And if you have X, like if you have 1, 2, 3, that means you don't. And then that's why I'm at here. Very few people, I think 5% of people who say they believe God could actually do that. I'm just putting that out. Maybe more can. Maybe you think you can. If you personally think you can, and you are a believer, let me know in the comment section if you do me the pleasure to do that. And I can hardly wait to see what people actually write.
Well, you and I always talk about people overusing the word literally, and it was interesting because recently one of my lady friends, she actually had the ceiling cave in her apartment. It actually fell on part of her bed, but she said fortunately it was when she wasn't there. What's it?
Are you serious? That's one of the worries that I have it's an occasional worry that happens when it rains because I hear like the dropping. I'm like, what if it just like
But she said, but here's what she said. She said to me, good thing it didn't happen when I was in my bed. That literally would have been a rude awakening. And I'm like, hey, that expression actually describes it here. If it like the ceiling falls. I'm like, yeah, that's actually correct use of the expression.
Wow, did she have insurance in the apartment? What happened?
I didn't get into those details, but she said she was getting it renovated. I guess like they're fixing it up, but yeah, it was pretty crazy though.
Trouble. Yeah.
All right, moving on. Let me see here. Okay. The next section is called Overreading Determination. We tend to overread determination in situations, like the person who says, well, of course it rained today. I didn't bring my umbrella. Even atheists will say things like, things happen for a reason. You know, I'm guilty of this too, where you'll be like, oh, of course, I happen to not bring an umbrella, then it rains, just my luck. You know, of course, the rain wasn't caused by you not bringing the umbrella. It's just you feel like, you know, it happened to you unfairly. So this is most obvious in children. Think of children asking why a billion times. children show what is called promiscuous teleology, that is a desire to understand the world in terms of purpose. Children have been shown to spontaneously adopt the concept of God and a created world with no adult intervention. So it could be argued that we're all born creationists, but disbelief requires effort. Now, obviously, this isn't to say that adults are paragons of rationality either. I don't think that even has to be said. Just look around. We too need to see the purpose in things. The fact of the matter is that understanding things like evolution and genes is extremely complicated. The average person isn't capable of knowing all the various genes, how and why they mutated as an adaptation to changes in the environment they evolved in, etc. We tend to overread purpose in things as a result, and religion fills that gap. Thoughts and comments?
Yeah. In fact, that's why it's like adults are actually, by virtue of just being adult and having a more expanded mind and having more things to draw from, is you're just more creative. And that's also part of what I'm saying. I think the current religions, this is borrowed from Christopher Hitchens, he says that comes from the infancy of our species. And as I mentioned with my like of epic sci-fi and operatic sci-fi, that kind of things, those things are religious in nature. We are talking about things that we don't know of, and we're just thinking and wishing and thinking this could exist, that could possibly exist. The beings that are discussed in some of these sci-fi things are above and beyond more powerful. Not even just the beings, the humans, the access that the humans have, the computers, just having a phone. We're talking about those things where you have all these answers in this book that you're supposed to have, and these answers don't have. But then try to imagine explaining what the internet and just a smartphone is to the people who were writing the Bible. Like, how would you even start to explain what that is to them? How would you even start to explain that much access to actual information? Like, how do you? Like, most religions pretty much just trying to figure out the germ theory. That's pretty much what it is. Just trying to figure out what's the existence of germs, the way germs affect us. Just the microscopic to the macroscopic. How do you explain the Oort cloud to somebody from 1,000 years ago, like 2,000 years ago? Like, there's some things that it's just that sort of storytelling. It's just a kid might try to express you through something, tell a story to you in a certain way that an adult will be able to tell it to you that much better. So when they look at this play, you're saying like the different levels of truth, of access to truth. I think adults are much more capable of actually going into more forms of artifice and artifice is not necessarily.
Well, the point that's come up because what is it? Richard Dawkins said an atheist could never get elected, and then somebody was saying like, oh, atheists are too smart or whatever, and someone made the point that with a lot of smart religious people, what it is they're better at coming up with rationalizations for their positions. So they find ways to sort of say, well, this actually means this, it describes this. Whereas like, it's sort of the bell curve thing, as we've talked about a few times, where it's like, the people on the far left of the bell curve will just say, oh, I do this because the book says so. People on the far right of it could say, well, no, this is true. Here's why it describes reality. Well, this fits into this. Here's why. But because they're smarter, they're able to come up with more complex rationalizations for them. And then it takes a smarter person to be able to argue against those. Yeah. Like they may be smarter. And I wondered that about my great grandfather. I mean, obviously I never knew him, but like he's one of those that like he's smart enough. He can build all these rationalizations for his position, which I would argue are ultimately wrong, but he's smart enough. It comes across as well argued. And for people who haven't delved in deeply or done the research, they sound very compelling. Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm trying to think personally. I went into some points where I was getting into some really deep apologetics, and now when I look back at some of these top debates of supposed top religious scholars, and like hearing them use lines and apologetics that I was thinking of when I was like when I was like 15, 16, I'm like, it's cringe. Like that's not another pitiful thing where I'm just like, do better. Like, but you can't do better because of the content. The content is so old, like you really can't do better about it. Just like if you look at a movie made recently, like you look at something like what was it? What was that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio where you go Inception? You look at the sort of storytelling that goes on in those things, how much people do to actually prevent there to be plot holes and connect things to each other. It's a lot more intricate and a lot more defined. You have storytelling being told over like hours and hours, having seasons and seasons of things tied together where you just can't find what it holds in, because people have become more advanced in storytelling. They're still trying to explain and express or get to the same spirituality and these kind of ideas that are they're external to just the materialist things that we have, just A plus B equals C. They're trying to express and tap into these other things. it's artistic. It's a adult is going to be a better artist. An adult with certain abilities will be a better artist than the most um, savant 5-year-old at the thing. In general, like just they have more to draw from. And I think we're at the point where we need we need we need we're getting to the point where we need new stories, we need new storytelling, we need a new form of art. The ways that we've been telling stories in the past just don't necessarily make sense. There's too many plot holes because people just didn't ask those questions. They just like we're not going to ask that question at all. Too many things was taken for granted. Yeah.
Well, and to relate to the genes thing he touched on, when I got into stuff like IQ, I found this very interesting because what they've explained is that with with genes for like your IQ, Steven Pinker, I guess, did some research into this too. It's not like you have this gene, you're smart. It's this gene increases your IQ by half a point. This increases your IQ by 1 point. This increases by another point. It's all these things working in tandem. But then the question becomes, why do some people have all those genes? Why do some people have some? Why do some people lack a lot of them? And then you would have to go through that person's evolutionary history and what did their ancestors do? And then were they in a society that selected for intelligence, so that got passed on? Then other people may have been smart but gotten killed off. It does get very complicated, but it's like, for me, the complication, it's a reason we keep asking questions, we keep delving in deeper. We don't just suspend our reason and say, oh, well, we don't know. I'm not a fan of that.
And then also goes further into certain things where it's the way you were raised, different ways, like the peaceful parenting type of idea, which I think does a massive thing. There's been tests in showing that like adverse childhood can knock down your basic IQ to like 15 points. And that's a massive thing. And then you think about how adverse childhoods have been for humans since the existence of humanity.
Yeah.
It's been a lot worse than now. You didn't have the time to think and ponder all these things when you're a child. Not even just being punished for it. Like nature itself would punish you. You couldn't just sit there and hear that twig and be like, what is the nature of a lion? It's like, no, the lion is on your face eating you. But now you have the thing where it's like you hear the twig, but then instead of just you hear the twig, but you understand there's already a village, there's people around there. They're able to actually trap they build the fence, they're guarding you, they trap the lion, they bring the lion in, you can look at the lion, you can start investigating the lion, then you can say, wait, this life form actually has similar limbs and why does it have 5 digits? Why do most like mammals have 5 digits instead of 6 in one hand, or like 8 on one paw and on one arm and then like 3 on the other? Why is there something? Then you start understanding there's a more of a relation between us and these things. So those are the kind of things, and just asking questions, being able to ask certain questions, entertain certain ideas. That's something that that actually enriches your IQ. Like being able to use something, even understanding that you can use a thing, makes that actually stronger and develops it to a different way. Whereas if you don't use a thing, it can atrophy. Like just because you're able to speak, if you never actually get into a point where there's other people who can hear you, you're not like they had that thing where they find feral children where they've passed the age of like learning their first language, and it's really difficult for them to actually pick up a language. Or you just look at people who speak languages; it's a lot easier to pick up a language when you're a kid, and then once you've grown to a certain age, your mind is kind of put in a certain form where it follows a certain language, and it's hard to pick up new ones. You start filtering things through that. So I think there is also limitations like that have had this, and that's also involving in the gods. Like you get certain belief systems in gods. Like I wonder, would there be a possible way to? Is there something innate about humans that believe in gods, or would there be a way to raise somebody in a situation where there isn't there? And that also comes to the general thing where most people understand you have to get kids into indoctrinate them earlier, because if you just start introducing kids to the Bible when a kid is like 13, they're like, I don't believe this. Like you gotta start early, otherwise that stuff doesn't get into them, and that's why the current religions want control of your children in preschool, and that's why they look at the people speaking in libraries. They want everybody in school organized because they want to be able to indoctrinate them into certain belief systems very early, and they understand how effective that is. Yeah.
It's funny you bring that up about feral children. I just thought of the Wild Thornberrys. I don't know if you ever watched that show. There was the character Donnie. He's basically a feral child. Like he never speaks. He just yells out. And I'm trying to remember his backstory, if like he was found in the wild or something. But then because Eliza can talk to animals, she can talk to the chimpanzee who's named Darwin. I thought that was kind of funny. It kind of relates to what we're talking about.
That's another thing. Like Hmm. Do people we're talking about it with it before, like the aliens show up, where the aliens have their own gods, and their idea that a god also creates just them and the aliens and things like that. And it also comes back to the point where it's like other mammals believe in gods. People say the loyalty that dogs have to humans, do they think that is something where it's like the dog looks at you as a god? I don't think that's slavish loyalty in that situation. That's why I was talking about. I think it's really only 5% that could come into an actual belief of a god, that they aren't just saying is a belief in God, but comes more to like a different sort of reliance, like a Stockholm syndrome type of thing, where somebody has a slavish devotion to someone, but you wouldn't say they consider that being to be a god. They just realize they have rationalized in their mind that that belief, holding that affection or that affinity to X person, being, thing, is a key part to them maintaining life. So I think that's separate from that, but yeah, I guess that's
Well,
why this book was written. Yeah.
you've seen that meme. It shows the wolf. It goes, "Oh, some humans by the campfire. I'll join them. What's the worst that could happen?" And it says, "Few thousand." It shows the pug with the birthday candles. It's almost like that though. Yeah.
And but that's the thing though. How much is that? What was
Mm.
that initial God like? Because we talked about that in last time. It's beyond the Sumerians. That was the first time we actually wrote it down. That's lasted historically. But before that, there were certain gods. And how much was it where now, if you lived in a community and you had that belief, you started selecting for it, and then we started selecting for a belief in God. Could they be a way to have an evolution of the Homo sapien, of the ape, without getting to a point? Is a belief in God part of the track of sentience, where eventually you're going to have a being like a God that fits in an actual God? Then after some time, you select for people who believe more in not just a God, but different propositions of gods, depending where you're at. It gives certain fitness, certain advantages, reproductive advantages in different places, and then that selects for it a while. Just like now with like the pugs, I think it's like pugs. There's like there's boxers. There's certain dogs that have been bred in a certain way that they could not exist in a state of nature. Like they've been
Yeah.
now they're symbiotic to humans. That without
Yeah.
humans, they have very short, painful lives. So that could be part of it, where they could be some people who have been we've bred, we've selected for a belief in deities, and I think it's not just deities, but we've selected for a belief in being able to comprehend and build off of things you don't directly see, because
Yeah.
that's what it is to like you think like you don't have to be in front of me for me to actually be cognizant of Steven's here. I can be like, okay, I'm not going to see Steven, or he's not physically here with me, but we can still have this conversation. Or I'm not in New York, he's not in Nairobi, but we can still schedule and say in the future we're going to do this. That time preference thing, I think, has that aspect of being able to comprehend things that that are not tangible to
Yeah.
malleable in physical sense. But yeah.
Well, that's what we talked about in the last section with decoupled cognition, mind body split, and all that. Like part of my brain physically perceives you, another part of my brain is thinking about what you're thinking. But it's like those are things are working in tandem, and that ties into the religious stuff which we've been discussing. Oh.
Yeah, and then something like that is most definitely not the same in everyone. Like we're not
Yeah.
made equal. So that's just another thing I need to continue to remind myself. Like there's certain things you might expect from people, but they're not able to do it to a certain level. Just like you wouldn't expect a 5 foot tall, 100 pound person to be able to dunk. So some of these things might just be some things might be expecting too much from certain people.
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right, that's the end of that chapter. Did you have any more thoughts or?
No, I think I'm good with that chapter. We
Sure.
can
All right.
possibly move on to the next one. I think
Sure.
we're still good in time.
Okay, sure. Okay. Chapter 7, Thy Will Be Done, Submitting to the Law of God, in parentheses S. Such social qualities, the paramount importance of which to the lower animals is disputed by no one, were no doubt acquired by progenitors of man in a similar manner, namely through natural selection, aided by inherited habit. It's Darwin again. So, first point is our deference to authority. There were studies done in 1961 at Yale by Stanley Milgram, which showed that about 2/3 of normal individuals will continue to administer an electric shock to a helpless, quote unquote, learner if commanded by an authority. Like, honor thy father and mother, thou shalt not have any other gods besides me. We all defer to authority to a point. It's just a question of how much. But this has been shown, what this experiment is showing is that under peer pressure, people will do even bad things because an authority commands it. Morality. Theists claim that without religion, people would be amoral and lawless. They are wrong. If our ancestors didn't have concepts of right and wrong, group cohesion would have broken down, and they wouldn't have survived. Humans tend to think that we are the only moral animals. Not true. Other animals show empathy, grief, compassion, comfort, trust, reciprocity, forgiveness, a sense of justice, remorse, spite, and more. Those have been downplayed as quote unquote building blocks of human morality, but instead they should be seen as composing the evolved moral system that a species needs for social cohesion. My brother sent me this video about it. Looks like a kitten is sleeping. It looks like it's having a nightmare, like it started crying at sleep, and then the mother cat hugged it. So things like that. Like other animals have these same tendencies too.
That's
Yeah, it's like, again, we may not be fully aware of it, but it's not like other animals don't comfort each other and stuff. They care for one another. Because same thing, they couldn't work together if they didn't do that. Yale psychology professor Paul Bloom and his team found that infants as young as 3 months old have an innate sense of right and wrong, good and bad, even fair and unfair. For example, they were shown a puppet climbing a mountain, which was either helped or hindered by another puppet. The baby's oriented towards the helpful puppet and away from the other one. Our moral systems are like learning a language. We internalize the values and automate them. Our morality seems to be a dual system that involves both conscious and automatic processes, as well as an after-the-fact conscious process that has been localized to the specific areas of the brain. Our emotional moral processes are in the orbitofrontal cortex at the bottom midsection of our brains. These areas are the part responsible for monitoring our social environment and our places in it. If there are changes in the environment, these parts are what get us to react. If the changes are positive, we approach. If negative, we avoid. Although we do defer to authority more than many of us would like to admit, like in the Milgram experiments, we do have moral emotions that help us negotiate our relationships with authority and allow us to decide which in-groups we are loyal to versus what out-groups we should avoid. Religions have served as shortcuts for allowing us to determine this. Purity is another moral emotion. One theory is it was a reaction to preventing us from eating rancid meat, but the disgust reaction also carries into social relationships. Disgust is a powerful moralizing emotion. I brought up, I was thinking, over the summer, there was a guy I used to work with who sent me a message saying, I looked at your profile. I'm shocked and disgusted at who you are. No need to respond. This isn't a conversation. Illustrates what I'm describing. He feels repulsed by things I post, but in terms of morality from an evolutionary psychology standpoint, it makes sense. And then think about some of the terms in religion, like violated, purity, things like that. There's a reason that these terms are used. Our conscious moral feelings are rationalization processes that allow us to justify our automatic emotional responses. Think of how this applies in terms of aesthetics, whether it being looking at something like art or a good-looking person. Now, of course, different schools of philosophy debate what are aesthetics. Is beauty in the eye of the beholder? Is beauty objective? Aristotle, I guess, had a whole view about, like, is beauty a reflection of something's qualities, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, whatever the case may be there, the way we feel when we see something that we perceive as beautiful, it's the reaction of all these beliefs that we've internalized. Again, depending on what they are. The cerebral cortex, which is the brain's outer layer, functions like a quote-unquote lawyer, which justifies our reaction to something. Sometimes that part of the brain can override our emotional response. Since I guess so many of our moral processes are unconscious, religion can make life easier by assigning us conscious reasons for feelings that seemingly arise out of nowhere with no conscious processing. If you follow the exact wording of religious texts, you could do things like sell your daughter into slavery. It's from Exodus 21:7. And then the author says, quote, genuine morality is doing what is right regardless of what we may be told. Religious morality, regardless of what we may be told. Religious morality is doing what we are told. Religion justifies reasons for doing this. Religion allows us to be part of the in-group that will be rewarded eternally or be spared damnation if we just do what we're told. Having religious belief is a lot easier than not having it. I think of Ayn Rand's comment about how religion is canned philosophy. Some people have said that she's not as harsh on religion as some of her successors, but she basically had the view that it's canned philosophy, like it gives you all the answers in advance rather than you having to think through all the various points. All right, thoughts or comments?
Yeah, not much really to add on this. I'm currently listening to the audiobook, re-listening to the audiobook, The Moral Animal by Robert Wright, which is sort of a primer on evolutionary psychology and does talk about certain things about how morality actually is decided through. There's actual reasons to see why morality would be decided. Right now, they're in a part where they're talking about I forget what the name of the experiment is, where the computer that wins with the tit for tat computer, where it says, like, if you're in a situation where the prison. It wasn't the prisoner's dilemma type of situation, but it's built off of the prisoner's dilemma type of situation where if two people are like, okay, we've caught you, we know you've done some crime. Like, if both of you say there's no actual, if both of you say you did nothing, both of you get like 3 years. If one of you says something and the other one says another one, the one who says something gets 1 year and the other one gets 5 years. If none of you say anything, then you get like no, the other one gets 10 years. If none of you say anything, you get five. So it was a situation where it's argumentation in that kind of situation. It's best for you to say something each time if you actually look at just basic thing, but then it's kind of beneficial for both of you not to say. So that was a testament, but they were talking about later on with a single test with a computer to say that the tit for tat is just a system where it's like you either do something good or you do something for your own benefit. And the computer that actually won in the test when different kinds of many different people had submitted programs to test about the behavior that's going to do something its own benefit while it cheats the other person, or actually says, yeah, we actually did, we both did the thing. So anyway, the tit for tat one actually worked. That said, if you say you just treat you first of all, you cooperate with the actual person that you meet at the first meeting. But then whenever that person does something, you treat them that way the next time. So if they lie the next time, then the next time you meet them, you lie. But then if you meet them again and they keep lying, you keep lying. But once they switch to the other point, you switch over. So there's actually a selection in nature that we've studied that seems to show why something like morality could actually be there. And I think that is key to this belief in God. That's key to the whole religion aspect, and part of why we're talking about, like, that's a story. It's a story that we tell, because often when you start getting in a debate with somebody who's a believer, and I'm thankful to the people who actually choose to actually get into debates on these things. Most of the time, they just don't want to talk about it. It's just something that in a room in a compartment they don't want to open. But the ones that often do, more often than not, it will come to an argument from morality rather than veracity. They'll start saying, but if this isn't true, we'll do these bad things. These other bad things will happen. So they'll be like, so even if you could convince us it's not true, all these other bad things would happen. So I think for most people who claim that, they seem to have gotten themselves into a rationalization to think that their morality is based off of accepting or saying they at least accept this. Whether or not that thing is accurate or not isn't important. It's just that is a social construct that we've developed that supports that, rather than it being the inverse, that is a social construct that was developed to make sense of our morality, not the inverse of this was something that was actually there, and then we developed morality based off of this. It's the inverse, I think, that people don't really realize.
Well said. What I was going to add to this too is we just talked a little bit about the woke religious fanatics trying to indoctrinate people into their belief system. You see a similar trend with them too, where they act like, oh, if we don't run everything, somehow we're going to go back to segregation and women being in the kitchen and all this. It's the same basic moral argument. Like, if our belief system is not in place, everything's going to fall apart and the world's going to go to hell. And then that gets to the point of, well, how many people don't follow your belief system and how many people are pushing for those things anyway? Like, I was talking to our friend Edward yesterday, and he made the point that, like, even most actual racist and sexist people, they don't just sit around thinking, how do we ruin the lives of minorities and women? Like, they have other things to do. And then it's like the average person on the street, of course, much less. So but they have this attitude like, if we're not in charge and control of everything, this is going to happen. And it's a very cynical view of just people in general. Like, we can talk about rationality versus irrationality, how informed are people this, but like, I don't think the average person on the street is malicious. And that's even why the book is called Cynical Theories, because it's a very cynical view of most people, which I think is very sad, honestly.
Yeah. And then this carries on. And that's, again, maybe where the self-selecting in the people that we know and we've met. And in the past, I did share some of these fears, but because I realize we're animals. I don't think we're different than animals. Yeah. And I look at most animals. Most animals don't. No other animal we know of has a belief in a God, but they're not just out raping and murdering each other. That's a convention that humans had. And then certain humans that say it's due to religion that reduces that. I ask them personally, are you not raping and pillaging personally because of your faith? Is that the only thing keeping you from raping and pillaging? And then if not, and that's how it is with, I'd be very surprised if one person really listened to this would really, if they just stopped believing in their wherever they believe in God, and would just wake up tomorrow and just rape and pillage just constantly until they get caught. I if you realize that you don't want to do those things for other things not based on your belief, why do you think other people would need the belief to do that? And sure, there might be some people out there who you can
Yeah.
find that something's wrong in their brain, or they just don't have a few things that they have to develop some kind of construct, and that's a key part to it. But I think that you'd find that's not the case for most people, and
No, no.
it's tough imagining. And I see that. I see how depressed some people are who do claim to believe some of these things, and it's a scary world that some of these people propose. And yeah,
And so, and the sad thing with this too is it becomes a vicious cycle, because what it is some of these people, they have a cynical view of certain people, so they won't interact with them. But then they continue to believe that those people are bad, and they continue to distance themselves from them. Then they only associate with other people who have the same toxic ideas, while they continue to carry the same negative views of those people. And in reality, if they realize the people are not the monsters that they think they are, they might meet some new good people who would uplift them, and their lives would be better for it. But they're convinced for various irrational reasons that those people are bad, and it's just dragging them down. Oh,
yeah.
yeah,
And the thing is, we are selected. Our genes are selected for reproduction.
yeah,
So we are not selected for valuing honesty over conformity, and then for valuing conformity over safety. Like, it's safety first, and then okay, if we can be safe and conform to other beings in our area, that's better. If we can be safe, conform, and honest, that's better on top of it. But I think when it comes to something like honesty and truth, that is one of the lower things. That's something that is really something that has become valued and has become a virtue rather recently in human civilization due to many other advancements that we had, because it was normally just reacting to things in nature. You didn't really have to. You didn't even really have the concept of something true or false. Like I don't think a dog like when you have the dog and you like do the thing and you like, or you pretend you're throwing the thing and the dog looks and thinks it's not like, oh, this human is lying to me. Like, it's this it every time it happens, the dog really thinks the ball has been thrown. I don't think they understand the concept of surgery. But then with some of these things, aren't there times when like a dog will break something and then it'll seem to be like kind of hiding? They've shown
yeah,
some
yeah,
things. So
yeah.
there's some different levels of definitions of expression that you can certainly see, and it's not the same with every dog. Certain dogs are smarter than other ones, and within those species, there's also smarter versions of that. So we might get to a point where we might actually see. There might be a point where we actually see an actual other Earthling achieve sentience, and that's something that could be coming. It could be really awesome to actually. I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime, but with evolution, you don't know. Maybe there's a gorilla being born today that's going to like say the first gorilla word ever. Like, I don't know these things, but it's kind of interesting to think that. But just the one thing that is rather certain to me is friendships, civilizations, societies, communities seem to be more organized over the lies they agree to tell each other and accept,
Yeah.
rather than the truth. Because if it's just truth, you just point out what's true. Anyone can walk in and out of any location and point out what's true. But it takes somebody who's familiar with that location and in group to understand that in this location, we don't talk about that because there's all these other reasons built of why we don't talk about that, or why we say this is one way rather than it just being the way it is. So I think that's a key thing. And that's not inherently negative, but to me, I value relationships, associations, friendships based off of the amount of honesty and truth and reality. The closer it is to that, and I do understand that is something that's more of a privilege, and that's something that I don't take for granted, and something that's granted to me as an option due to many other things that other people have done that I'm really thankful for them having done to be at this point in time. Yeah.
I have to ask Edward, we were talking about social metaphysics yesterday, and it was the whole idea about like Ayn Rand talked a lot about it. Nathaniel Branden definitely continued it. It's the whole idea of like people who do things not based on, is this right? Do I agree with it? But rather, is this popular? Will this get approval? And I think what it is unfortunately a lot of people are more in the social metaphysical camp. And he explained, I'm trying to think if it was Emerson, it may have been somebody else. They wrote an essay about this like way before Branden's time. But the idea of like, he's like, you know how to basically, he didn't word it this way, but his basic argument was how to get out of becoming a social metaphysicist. Go into the woods and just survive on your own, and then come back to society and ask, how many of these people do you need? How many of them do you want? does their approval matter? And I think in a modern world, I mean, I'm not saying you have to do that, obviously, but like, I think put yourself in some situation, like move somewhere where you're alone, do something in some situation where you have to really figure things out. Then you realize you can make new friends, you can meet new people, you can do things for yourself. And, you know, obviously I'm not saying don't be social. You'll still make friends and have connections, but you're a self-determined person doing it based on the facts of reality. Whereas
Yeah.
previously you're so dependent on everyone else that's why you follow the group. That's why you're scared to speak out of turn. That's why all this, because it hinges on what does the group approve rather than you doing what's best for you. And then people will supplement and help embrace and enhance that.
Yeah. Just being,
I gotta find that essay. I'm trying to remember. He mentioned it all, but like, I'm gonna ask him. I'm gonna try and read that later, though.
yeah, do that. That'd be interesting in seeing that because yeah, that's true. Like be an agent, actually exercise your agency in your day to days. There's many things that you can just default in, but I think it improves completely. And even when you exercise that agency, you might find out that the thing that you default into, that you initially just had that instinct, this is what you're going to do, you might find that's actually what you end up doing anyway. But the fact that you actually chose it and you thought about it will make it actually stronger for you to actually do it, because now some of the things that you default into, there might be some things that you just drop suddenly because something else comes along or some few conditions change. But if you've actually thought and selected into it, then you might be in a position because you chose to do it based on more empirical evidence, more solid evidence. When that thing that would have made you drop it happens, instead of dropping it, you say, no, I'm going to stick on it, or I might just put it aside for a bit and come back to it later rather than just leaving it at the side. So just being an agent, if you listen to this right now, you live in an unprecedented time in human history where you probably have more access to choice in your actual day-to-day life than any of your ancestors have. And it's a damn shame if you're not actually taking advantage of that and actually utilizing that in your life. Yeah.
But again, it relates to the point of what you and I have done about we develop ourselves, we develop our values, and we seek out people accordingly. A lot of other people, unfortunately, just go with the flow because it's easier. They perceive it as less risky and all that. And ultimately, people rob themselves of their true potential, as you're saying, because it's like you don't have to do that. We're not stuck. You're not stuck in some tribe in the wild where these are the only people you'll interact with, and if you go against them, they're going to kill or kick you out. That's not going to happen. You have the ability to seek out other people and do other things.
Yeah.
All right. Next point. Kin psychology. We evolved to recognize and favor our kin over strangers. This developed not just as a survival strategy, but also to help preserve the copies of our genes that reside within our kin. We evolved to favor those with our genes rather than those without. Religions invoke and exploit this. This also relates to the concept of attachment, which I mentioned earlier. Nuns are quote-unquote sisters or mother superior. Priests are fathers or brothers. The Pope is the Holy Father, and the Church has even been called the Holy Mother Church. This exploitation shows up in the recruitment of suicide bombers. They appeal to would-be recruits by bringing up how their fellow Muslim brothers and sisters are being mistreated, and also how going through with what they will do will not just lead to them getting to heaven, but also their family getting to heaven as well. This instinct is so strong that people will side with their quote-unquote kin in their religion over their real-life kin. For example, there was an al-Qaeda-linked insurgent who killed his father for refusing to quit his job as an Iraqi interpreter for the U.S. Army. And another real life example is Jonestown and the lives lost there. People saw that cult as this is our family. We're willing to commit suicide for that. That's where the whole expression drinking the Kool-Aid comes from. Thoughts or comments?
Yeah, this is also another part that's in the book, the kin selection and things like that, how we select for that. And then family is not the same as relatives, but both family and relatives are part of your kin when they're talking about this kind of situation in the sense that your relatives are people who are biologically related to you. Like you don't have to know your relatives, but I don't think it's possible to not know somebody and consider them part of your family. Now, you'd have to know certain things about that person. Like if it's just like you might see somebody and assume like, okay, you might know that if you feel you're part of a family that's in a religion, this is part of your relatives, this is part of your kin in that kind of greater sense, then anybody who you don't know who actually holds those beliefs as well, you would consider them part of it. But if you just randomly saw that person and you didn't know that about them, you wouldn't consider them to be part of that kin, that family type of idea. And another key thing with that one is just a simple thing. When you marry somebody, in most cases, they're not they're far enough away from you on your family tree wise that you're not technically related, but they become part of your family. So it's a distinction to see there. Now, I think also when it comes to gods, you say we're all part of, we're all God's children, we're all part of that greater family. Now, how much of that depends on somebody believing? The whole thing is people say like, "Oh, you might not believe, but I'll pray for you anyway." Like Jesus loves you anyway. That's
Yeah.
one of the things that I think it's kind of fallen out of favor. Maybe I just talk to a different quality of faithful people where I don't hear that dismissive thing anymore. Like, "Oh, I'm not going to listen. You're going to hell, but Jesus loves you anyway. I'll pray for you anyway." Like that used to be something that I think used to happen more often when I was still more in my anti-theist point, and I guess I was speaking to less sophisticated people in their belief. But like they say that kind of thing. So that whole idea is another thing that's rather new. In the past, religions, once they changed from animism into like the ancestor worship type of things, it was gods of different families, and then it got to the point where the god was actually below the family, then that god would be bestowing their favor on different family lines and things like that, or the spirits or the things like that would be in certain families would be in favor of that. But it was still limited to certain people, where it was like, let's take Zeus, for example. Zeus wasn't the god of the Incans. No one at that time, whoever believed in that, thought Zeus was also the god of the Incans. Like, the
No.
Incans were different people. They were not part of Zeus's people. Like Tenochtitlan or whatever, he wasn't part of the people who made the people that came across the ocean. Like, the gods used to be very limited in that situation. But then now we have the major Abrahamic gods who they're like, even if you don't know about this god that is your god, you are part of it. So, and even if you take it to that point, most of the fundamentalists will not treat all the people who are God's children, even though they say we're equally God's children. They will treat the people who claim belief and worship and follow the rules of this specific God in a different way than that one. And most of those gods themselves also go in and say, you are the chosen people, versus these people are not, even though we're all the children. And again, switching off, that all matches the human societies because in practicality, we can say we love all our kids equally, but nobody really does that.
No.
Nobody really loves all their relatives equally. There's reasons and qualifications for you to have closer connections to anybody else in your life. And as humans have different relationships and things to form, their gods and our beliefs in gods also match the different relationships that we had with our societies and things like that. So, yeah.
Well, it was interesting too because I was listening to someone talk about the Stoics and their concepts of natural rights, and also the sort of the earlier ideas of what we call cosmopolitanism today. Like the idea that I guess they had sort of this pantheistic view, and the idea was that each of our soul is actually a fragment of God's soul, and because of that, all our souls are interacting on the planet with each other, and because of that, there's a common humanity in all of us. So you're not just a citizen of this tribe of this polis, but you're also a citizen of the world, essentially. I don't think they phrased it that way, but it was that sort of idea. And that the Stoics, as far as I know, they're some of the earliest people to sort of oppose slavery. Like there was no official abolitionist movement, but they were people saying things like, wait a minute, we all have souls, we're all part of God. If that's the case, well, does one being have the right to get wealthy off of the work of another? And that was sort of like the beginning rumblings of abolition. Again, there was no explicit abolition movement, but there were people who were starting to float those ideas around. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And some of the abolitionists later, I think they picked up on some of those arguments, which could probably be traced back to the Stoics, even though they don't realize that fully.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, because this the default is definitely not believing in gods. But then there was a time when I
Yep.
think we selected for them being a situation where it was somewhat more advantageous to your reproductive fitness in order to have some sort of belief in some god, depending on the structure that you had. So I wonder how many times has there been a relatively have the conditions existed for to return to that default existence of life form nature of not having a belief in, not like as I mentioned, not the belief of that I think comes with sentience, a belief of things existing without you being cognizant of them, directly cognizant of them, but specifically tying that section of awareness into an actual being and feeling that that section of awareness needs to be answered by an identified being in a society. And maybe it goes back to what I'm saying with the 5%. Maybe we're never really at that, where we always at the point where it's just signaling, where it's saying, you're saying you're saying I can't wait, while you really mean I can't hardly wait. So in actuality, they're aware that there isn't truly something there because it's not even based on empirical evidence, but you realize that this saying it is what you need to say in order to to have the safety and the conformity rather than just insisting on honesty, because there's not really any benefit to be truly honest that you don't believe what everybody else is saying. And for many people, they just, what is there to really gain from it? Like the recent thing we were mentioning earlier with Lil Nas X recently just came out, and he had like 666 sneakers from Nike, and he went in and he decided to do like some 666 like Satan version of them, and supposedly said there was a drop of human blood in the soles. It was just some modified Air Max type of things. And then Nike came out and sued them, and they settled outside of court. There was big hullabaloo about that. The United States of America claims to be one of the most Christian or religious of the major world powers, of the most developed countries in the world. And when it comes down to the actual practicality, you look on average in Europe, let's say in Sweden, which has maybe, I think 65% of the population say they're atheist. But the people that are Christian, that would identify as Christian, I think when it comes down to it, they would be a lot more fundamentalist. And I think the day-to-days, their belief would affect them in a lot stronger of a way than the average Christian in the United States of America. Because the average Christian in the United States of America on the day-to-day actually lives more atheistically in the general sense than the average Swedish atheist, in my estimation of my experience from it. And maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong in your life, if anybody who else has listened to this. But from my experience, I kind of see in that kind of situation. So maybe they're just kind of saying it to say it, and it's not necessarily something that they truly believe. So we already are at that point where, in general, it's just getting to the point where it's more comfortable. It's less detrimental for you to just be honest about your lack of belief. So that's just something that's changing. Yet in the United States of America, there's just been more of the vestiges of signaling that for some sort of social benefit. Like finishing off with a Lil Nas X, why did Nike come out and feel they have to all of a sudden say this is horrible when many other forms of modifications for their sneakers has been done? Because there still is a vestige in the United States of America where that might be significant, yet they've also been virtue signaling for other things that are not really that significant. Why do they come out in support of Black Lives Matter, but they don't come out in support of what's happening in Hong Kong? Although for Nike's sake, to be specific, they did come out and say they're going to stop using cotton and stuff like that from the Xinjiang province in China, which is probably using some kind of slave labor, yet the NBA is still using sneakers. Yeah. Supposedly these pro-Black people are still using sneakers from people who literally use some kind of slave labor to pick cotton. It's just a disgusting situation. So in all these things, why do people feel the need to virtue signal certain beliefs and not others? And then take above that, what takes the belief from just virtue signaling to actually acting on that belief is something that's interesting to see.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting because, you know, I've read stuff about what some of the early church fathers said about their attacks on reason, their attack on science, their attacks on curiosity even. And it could easily be argued, of course, that the current Christian, their position is vastly an improvement. Now, this is largely the result of living in Western wealthy countries. I'll definitely take the modern Christians over the people back then. But then, of course, my other criticism here would be, well, the problem with this is people get the causal factors mixed up of how much of their morality and some of the things that they do that I would agree with, how much of it's Christianity versus Greco-Roman things. And that's where I think people really need to look and see what came from where, and like what values are you assimilating that are really as a result of the Bible, or is it in spite of the Bible and you're just picking and choosing certain parts alongside it?
Yeah. I just did a recording that I shall be posting probably before this part comes out of Murray Rothbard. No, not Rothbard. Ludwig von Mises. It's an excerpt from the essays of Ludwig von Mises, Money, Markets, and something else. It was essays put together after he passed away by his wife, and there's something talking about how liberty is uniquely something about the West, and that's something that I've been over and over again talking about, how the West is not the best. The West is a current result of the best way human beings have figured out how to deal with society, how to construct a society. And he was talking about how liberty itself is a concept that is uniquely Western, and these other things were not necessarily the same. Some of the things that come in religions and beliefs, and I think that is rather true. And that's one thing. Like, is something truly? Can you truly believe in something that doesn't actually affect the way you act? Because if somebody like says they believe in liberty, but they don't act in defense of liberty or spreading liberty, then is that really something that they believe in? You know, if someone says they believe in a God that's watching them all the time, that will judge them that would say that if you do this action, it's a sin and you're going to hell, then would they technically really be able to actually engage in that action if they truly believe that person is watching them? And that's what I'm saying. Like, do the people truly believe? Because if somebody holds a gun, walks into a room, shoots someone in the face, and says, the next person that looks me in the eye, I'm shooting them in the face. Somebody looks them in the eye, they shoot them in the face, and then they walk up to you. Would you look them in the face? I don't think you would, because you believe that person will shoot you. But I think that's how many people are, who they say that, yes, God is this being that has said, do this or you will suffer for eternity. And they still do those things. And I'm like, do you really believe that thing? Because why would you still do it? It's a tough thing. Yeah.
All right. So speaking of signaling, there's one final point in the chapter: costly signaling. A person is taken more seriously if a promise comes with a hard to fake, honest, costly signal of commitment. A down payment, what's that?
That's kind of what we're talking about a bit. Like,
yeah.
When you signal
A down payment, self-flagellation, moving away to join a group, etc. These costly signals are part of our relationships. Religions use these quite well by demanding long and tedious rituals, time, money, sacrifice, and other things. Now, in biology, there's something called Zahavian signaling, named after, I guess, an Israeli biologist. I learned about this through Gad Sad, that you see this in animals as well. For an animal to be perceived as a good mate, it has to do something that's considered expensive to that animal. So the theory behind why peacocks have this beautiful plume is it takes lots of resources to grow those feathers and all this, but at the same time, the peacock has to drag that around. It has to keep itself safe from predators, all that. And then in humans, you've seen this in the past. Fencing, dueling scars were actually considered a sign of manhood, because the idea is you were willing to go toe to toe with a blade unsheathed against another guy. But if you had scars but still survived, it meant you survived. So that was a test of manhood. And that's why it's showing it's a costly signal. And this is why we make fun of, obviously, the SJWs and everything. Virtue signaling is there's no cost to do that. There's no cost to put a black square on your profile. There's no cost to put the flag of a country when a country is attacked. But it's like, going out protesting against police that could possibly hurt you, giving speeches in dangerous areas, Daryl Davis going and deconverting Klan members. That takes courage, because that's a high risk to you. And that's why he has so much respect from people, because he's willing to go into the lion's den and come out alive and still win. But it's like, anyone can just say, yeah, I hate the Klan. It's like, well, that's a popular view. There's nothing brave or bold about that.
Yeah. Huh. And that's what we're talking about with the benefits. Like, what is truly the benefit to live in Saudi Arabia right now and be like, I don't believe in I don't believe in Allah. If you're not planning on leaving Saudi Arabia, what is the actual benefit to do that? Maybe somebody cares enough about Saudi Arabia to think that if they drop that, they could imagine a more secular place that accesses better involvement. They have other connections to people they consider their kin and family in that place. But then much of that is also based on that. So yeah, that's a tough thing. And this is the thing we look back and some of the people with the witch trials and those kind of things and the religious wars, like it was different. It seems like, but then also with history, as we mentioned, majority of history is really just a few million people, and then the actual people that are involved. Like when we talk about these wars, it's not like every single person was in war. Yes, people would come through and run roughshod through like in villages when you have like the 7-year war, but it doesn't mean like 95% of the population was actually involved in making one side of the knot of that war. Most of them were just trying to live their daily lives, and then the elites, the 5% of them, were the ones kind of marshaling people around, and occasionally they'd come and like, oh, you have to come and support us in this battle because this person said this thing about my daughter or didn't marry this person. So there was kind of those kind of things. So was there ever really a time when, like, what is, and there have been some people who've gone to the point where they're like, okay, yes, you're persecuting me for not believing, like the Socrates story where they said, like, instead of me coming out and just saying no, the thing they actually took it, but that's whether he was real or not, there's some kind of things like that. Or again, with the story in the Bible, when they talk about that with Jesus saying like, okay, the devil was saying, okay, you just accept and I'll give you all of this. But then with that story, again, this is what I'm saying, is some of the quality of these stories is different, because with that story, if Jesus was technically God made flesh and he was aware of that as well, the devil was offering him all this land, but if God is the creator of everything, that was already God's property. Like the devil couldn't offer him something he already created and owns. So that's kind of a bit of a reduction in the kind of situation. He also knows as a God, he's eternal, so he's not really going to be able to die. So what's really a threat of death? Like, anyway,
Yeah.
but the whole situation, like, how many people's beliefs are truly strong enough to say, like, if you just signal that you don't believe this, you will stay alive. And I don't know if I'm strongly enough in my belief of atheism where I feel like if all of a sudden they got some sort of Western or westernized Sharia law or some kind of regime happened here in Nairobi, Kenya, where I'm at, where they say you have to say you believe in the Anglican Church because that's one of the major churches here. Like you have to at least signal you believe in it or we'll kill you. I don't know if I care enough to be like, yeah, I'm good to say that I don't. Like, I don't know. Maybe you will call me weak or, or this kind of thing. But if I don't really have to change too much of my day-to-day life by just signaling,
Yeah.
if I did that, I probably would signal if the thing was like that death. Now, if they said I had to go to church, I had to do all these other things, I had to give my money to these kind of things, or I had to start teaching kids these kind of things, that's when I would start objecting. So that again is just going back to my question: with the belief in God, how many people truly believe in God? Because I think just saying something and it not really affecting your actions, is that truly a belief? If you truly believe gravity exists, you don't walk off of tall buildings. You know, so if somebody says, I don't believe gravity exists, but they never walk off a tall building, then I'm like, do you really believe you can fly? Do you really believe you can levitate by you just saying that? But so if you just say that and it doesn't really affect your actions, it's kind of a pointless thing to me. So if your belief in God is something that doesn't affect your day-to-day actions, it's not a belief that I'm concerned with or discussing here, and I'm not even sure if that's a sort of belief that could actually exist. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. That's the end of the chapter. I didn't really have much else. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
So winding that down with the ramble, I think the my rambles today have been seemed to be a bit more off. Apologies if they were sporadic, but I like having these open form conversations with Stephen.
Yes, of course.
Just things that we discuss even offline, and we're glad to be able to record some of these, and we really appreciate when you take your time to come listen to these.
Sure.
Anything else you want to say?
That's all I have. There's only chapters 8, 9, and 10 left. They are a bit longer, though. In fact, they make up over half my notes, so they're going to be a bit longer. But I think you're going to find them very interesting, though, because it gets into things
Okay,
about brain chemistry and ritual and pretty cool stuff. Oh.
cool. So we
Yeah.
shall be back for that, and there's still ongoing posting of the series as we're recording this. I should be able to get the last parts done of the conversation of Harbert Marcuse's essay on liberation, and then I shall be posting that thing I talked about with Ludwig von Mises, and we shall be continuing these. And probably by the time, maybe, possibly, kind of, sort of, I'm not going to promise anything. By the time we actually get these ones up and done, we'll already have the series on human action. Because I think once the human action thing starts going on, I'll just be posting those, even if we have other things on the side that we're going in. But unless you have anything else to say, I think
That's all I have.
Okay, so goodbye, everyone, guys, girls, and
Bye.
everything else in between. Yeah.
Thank you for listening.